Chapter 3. Aquina was industrious as ever. Merchants selling their goods, peasants buying them, tradesmen plying their trades, and people scurrying around, busy with daily errands. The marketplace was a long, wide street, bedecked with marble pillars and dotted with commercial stands. Cloth and jewelry merchants called out to prospective customers and tried to sell to anyone who paused to listen. Once an icon of prosperity, Aquina had always enjoyed a healthy economy. This was due mostly to the town mint, created by none other than Aquina Akara herself. Few locations could boast such an abundance of gold and minerals. Luther, Aquina's brother, named the place for her during his reign. She oversaw the building of the city from scratch, electing her chief engineer, Lord Aguilon, to govern it, before returning to her brother's side in Cyrene 7 years later. Balius watched the place grow into a thriving, well-developed city. He fostered a legacy of ruling sons, which governed Aquina for generations. The Aguilons were a noble family of some repute, known for their wisdom, kindness, and generosity. Even after Cassius's abhorrent takeover, people were relatively happy in Aquina, and there was no doubt it was one of the most desirable locations in the kingdom. Dismayed to see wanted posters of themselves plastered all over the city, Aquestria tugged her hooded sister away from the food stands. "Come on, we must get to Lord Aguilon as soon as possible." She tugged on the edge of her own hood. "Even with these, we still risk being recognized." Plowing their way through the throngs of people, they steered toward the castle, sitting visibly upon a hilltop. Massive stone battlements, tall towers, spiral staircases, spacious rooms, and spectacular views were just a few of this building's virtues. Secret tunnels, a dungeon labyrinth, a remarkable hedge garden maze — the Aguilons loved puzzles — and a deep encompassing moat were features that really made the place unique. From a distance, one would assume the family that called the castle home had been particularly fortunate and immune to calamity. But upon closer scrutiny, it was evident this wasn't the case. The drawbridge sagged precariously to one side, and chips of mortar littered the weeds at the base of the wall. The portcullis was inoperable, and was hinged at an awkward angle, barely high enough to admit a rider on horseback. No one was in sight, and the inner gate was shut tight. Misfortune had befallen the once immaculately kept castle, or more accurately, Cassius had befallen the place. Famine and poverty had struck many of the villages and towns, mostly due to Cassius's neglect and greed, but also due to some unfortunate weather. Through clever management and food storage, Aquina had been spared some of the hardship. Several years back, the so-called king ordered all Aquinian men over the age of 15 to war with the neighboring kingdom of Copperund. Hoping to rid himself of any future competition or trouble, Cassius ordered all Acaran lords to battle as well. And so, Philip II, Pantheus's father, Lord of Aquina, and his 16-year-old son, Willimon, were forced to fight. Being only 14 years old at the time, Pantheus was too young to join them. Humiliated and angry that he couldn't, Pantheus had snuck into the ranks. When his father discovered him, he'd threatened him with a month in the dungeon and given him the spiel about the importance of being responsible for Aquina in his absence. He'd then sent him home with a chaperone. The war was fierce, but short-lived. Many were killed, including Philip, Willimon, and Adeward de Cora. Aduard de Cora, Aquestria and Kessa's father, was a knight of the high court, a clique of superbly gifted, loyal associates of the king. Knights, beloved relics of the past, whom Cassius had disbanded after his takeover, were considered highly valuable, with their vast array of skills and allegiance solely to King Ash. Strong, talented, and noble, Aduard was a court favorite and well respected among the general populace as well. Conspicuously, his duty was to represent the royal family in tournaments or festivals, but inconspicuously, he was to ensure that peace, justice, and the law were being properly observed, and that the realm was running smoothly. In other words, he was a spy. He reported any suspicious activities or issues and verified that the lords and local law enforcers were not abusing their powers. The de Coras had frequently visited Lord Philip at his castle, as Aquina was one of the knight's recurrent favorite destinations. Aduard's wife and third child had both died in childbirth. Philip and his wife kindly offered to watch Aduard's daughters whenever his occupation prevented him from doing so. Since the girls had already stayed at the castle so often, essentially growing up alongside Williman and Pantheus, the adjustment wasn't a difficult one. They were loved and treated like family. Occasionally, their father took them with him, but it was rare for these trips to last longer than a month. When Cassius usurped the throne and dispersed the high court, Aduard adamantly refused to return to Cyrene or have anything to do with him. So Aquina had become their long-term home. Shortly after, the war claimed the lives of Philip, Aduard, and Willimon. A month later, Pantheus's mother also passed away of a fever. Speculation had it that she really died of a broken heart. Regardless of the cause, Pantheus, barely 15, was entrusted to govern Aquina, which he had successfully, despite his youth, for 9 years. Aquestria used the hilt of her sword to knock on the heavy door. The ornate knocker had disappeared. A faint impression was the sole evidence that there had been one. "Is anyone there? I come seeking your lord." She pounded the hilt to wood once more. "We are known to him and seek an audience. It's most urgent." For a time, no one answered. Finally, a bonneted head became barely visible through a window overhead. "Go away! Didn't you hear that Lord Aguilon died almost 2 years ago?" The two girls glanced at each other in dismay, and after a brief silence, Aquestria raised her voice to the aging woman. "We heard no such news." "Well, 'tis true, whether you heard it or not. Be off with you. I've got work to do." "Who is your master now?" "Who is king of this forsaken land? Now be off." The woman's head disappeared, preventing further questions. "Cassius," Aquestria murmured woefully. After a long pause, Kessa, who'd been staring at the spot where the woman's head had been, stated, "She could have at least told us the circumstances." "Why would she? She doesn't know us. Besides, would you really want to know?" Aquestria placed her hand gently on her sister's shoulder. "This is dreadful. Poor Pantheus." Kessa pulled away awkwardly. She stood still for a prolonged time, and then her forehead thudded against the wood. Not once, but twice, before resting against the surface. Aquestria watched her sister, unsure of how to comfort her or what to do next. When Kessa didn't budge for several minutes, she felt an urge to explain the situation, as if that would help. Pantheus inherited some of the most valuable land in the kingdom. With the Aquinian people behind him, he could have become a serious threat to Cassius, she said. It's no secret that Aquina suffered the severest loss during the war, and hatred of the king is rampant here. Pantheus himself lost his entire family to that war. He'd never cooperate with Cassius. Imagine the trouble he'd incite with Aquinian gold and the support of the populace at his fingertips. Aquina's northern neighbor, Tania, has a lord who is an established dissenter. There's a lot of strain, enough that Cassius had positioned a portion of his army there. If Pantheus and Lord Tanius had rallied their people and cut off the largest source of gold in the land, they'd 100% be a thorn in the king's side. Cassius would have killed just for the possession of the Aquinian mint, irrelevant of the lord's allegiance. Aquestria finished. Kessa groaned in desperation and peeled her forehead off the door. Yes, it's likely Pantheus was a victim of the king's vile plotting. Unfortunately, he's among many others. Noting her sister's now deadpan endeavor to shrug off the horrible news, Aquestria chose to forego dwelling on it. Their predicament didn't exactly allow for a mourning period just then, anyway. Their plans for refuge and assistance frustrated, the girls left the city and followed the Irenian River into Ashland Forest. Finding an adequate spot to camp, they sat down to rest. Kessa pulled a small loaf of bread, some fruit, and even a half-empty bottle of some unknown concoction from beneath her cloak. Kess, where did you get those? Aquestria demanded, using her nickname for her sister. A shoulder shrug was her only reply. You stole them, didn't you? From the stands on the way to the castle. Tiny though the smirk was, Aquestria still caught it. Kessa, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're only making things worse. How so? I'm already sentenced to hang. We're outlaws, so we're forced to live like 'em. Besides, even if we'd had money, you wouldn't have stopped long enough for me to buy them. She took a long swig from the bottle and hiccuped. Eyeing the bottle with contempt, Aquestria quipped, I suppose you drank half that on the way here. Fair and cider. It's the good stuff. Want some? She offered, to no avail. Eat up, Addie. You must be hungrier than I am. Aquestria glared at the nibbled bread. That's only because you've been snacking. Rolling her eyes, she nabbed the bread and took a hungry bite. Chewing the morsel of bread and taking another bite, she declared grudgingly, Well, at least you steal the best. Kessa grinned. Leaning against a tree, one leg flat, the other leg bent to support her elbow, the youngest Decora sat, twirling a twig between her fingertips and staring at the fire. The sound of someone approaching didn't dent her deep concentration. A fresh log being thrown loudly onto the fire stirred her attention rather rapidly, though. What were you thinking about? Aquestria inquired, setting down the pile of firewood she'd gathered. I could have been Malleus. Kessa sighed, lying down. If you were the dungeon keeper, I'd be dead regardless. No one hears him coming. She sniffed, blinking rapidly, as if something were in her eye. Noticing that Kessa avoided her question, and knowing why she had, Aquestria dropped the subject. Pantheus's death was deeply troubling her also. A couple of years had passed since they'd seen him, and their last visit hadn't been, well, copacetic. Their previous visit to Aquina had gone better, at least for Aquestria. For her, it didn't matter how much time was spent apart. Pantheus and her camaraderie was never affected. This was not the case with her sister and the Lord of Aquina. Between them, she'd perceived a pronounced awkwardness, even bitterness. Nevertheless, the loss of Pantheus devastated Kessa as much as it did her. "I will miss Pantheus too," she whispered. "You'll feel better in the morning. Grief always seems to do its worst at night." Tilting her head to one side, she added wryly, "Of course, the cider doesn't help any." Closing her eyes, Kessa said drearily, "Dear sister, as much as I share your sentiments, I was actually trying to figure out what to do next. I think Malicious knew about Pantheus being dead. Maybe that's why he gave us a day. He's like a cat toying with mice, catching us and then letting us go only to catch us again. He's known from the start we don't have a hope of escaping. Pantheus was our only hope. Any moment now, I expect Malicious's giant paw to slam down on top of us. Don't lose hope. Now is when we need it the most. Hope has killed many. Hope is a foolish thing. It's only foolish to those who've lost it. In the morning you'll feel better. You always do." Yawning drowsily, Kessa professed, "That's if morning comes without seeing us in the cat's maw." Fortunately, morning did arrive, without any cat's maw. And just as Equestria had predicted, her sister was in a perceptibly better mood. Although dark storm clouds had promised a miserable night, only a light sprinkle of rain had watered the canopy of colorful leaves. The fresh, fragrant smell of rain lingered and delighted the girls, even though the fire was difficult to rekindle with damp wood. After eating fried eggs, thinking ahead, Kessa had acquired the eggs in town the day before. Miss Decora patted her belly, stretched, and lazily inquired, "What's next, sis?" Equestria smirked. "You mean all that thinking you did last night didn't help any?" Kessa's brightness dimmed as the memory of yesterday's news resurfaced. Equestria bit her lip, chastising herself for being so careless. Her sister would have rather jumped in a pit of snakes than admit she'd been grieving for Pantheus, and the jab both retriggered her grief and embarrassed her. Equestria began to mumble an apology, but Kessa stood up, shrugged, and set off for the woods. "While you decide where we go from here, I'm going to bathe," she called back. "Be careful," was all Equestria could manage before the youngest Decora disappeared. The Irenian river was as warm as Kessa remembered, despite it being fall. She scooped up some water and tasted it, as sweet as she remembered too. A slight smile curved the corners of her lips as she recalled Pantheus's expression and gasp of horror when she'd pushed him in 14 years back. Zealous swimmers themselves, Aduard and Equestria encouraged her love of the water and taught her to swim at an early age. At 6 years old, she was an avid, reasonably skilled swimmer, having taken to the water like a duck in her toddler years. The first time Pantheus came to play with them at the river, he'd stayed away from the water. Puzzled and worried about his aversion, she'd been certain that once introduced to the water, he'd have no problem swimming. He just needed a push. He was 4 years older than her, after all. It had been quite a shock for her when his head sunk beneath the ripples and didn't resurface. Not once had it occurred to her that she might be wrong. Luckily, her father, who'd been watching, was able to dive in, locate Pantheus, and pull him out before he'd drowned. As punishment for her brash act, she'd been confined to her room for 3 days and assigned extra duties for weeks. For his part, Pantheus avoided her for a while, only speaking to her out of necessity. Since their parents were close friends, Equestria, Willimon, Pantheus, and Kessa had known each other since birth. Aquestria and Willimon were born 6 months apart, a fact that had delighted both sets of parents. Pantheus came along 2 years later, followed by Kessa 4 years after that. Due to the similarity in age and mutual interests, Aquestria's and Willimon's parents had arranged a betrothal between them. But the war had thwarted those plans. After the deaths of their parents, Pantheus and the girls had remained close, grateful for the kinship and solace. Eventually, Aquestria's career drew her away from Aquina, and correspondence between them was as scarce as their visits. Somehow, Kessa couldn't believe Pantheus was dead. It just felt all wrong. Like the fork-tongued serpent of death had had too much theron cider and had coiled the wrong soul. It had been 2 years since she'd seen or interacted with Pantheus, and yet, with the finality of his death, she felt her world would never be the same. She wished he were there now, sitting on the riverbank, watching her swim, with that strange, boyish grin on his face, like he used to when they were adolescents. Of course, if he were there now, he wouldn't be a teenager. Her youthful memory adapted, converting the boy into a 24-year-old man, reclining on the bank while she swam. It was a pleasant daydream that did odd things to her stomach. Then reality struck. Sadly, that would never be. Kessa shook her head, hoping to whisk away her thoughts and memories like a breeze whisks away dandelion seeds. When that didn't work, she dunked underwater and stayed under for some duration, focusing exclusively on how the current played with her hair. It felt good. The Irenian felt like an old friend that distracted her for as long as she could hold her breath. And since she'd been practicing holding her breath for years, that was a while. Bobbing up to gulp a breath, she was surprised to behold 4 large hooves on the grassy bank. It took forever for her eyes to reach the armor-clad individual atop the impressive horse. Assuming by the sheer size of him that he was male, Kessa wrapped her arms about herself, cursing the water for the small amount of modesty it bestowed. Her cheeks bright crimson, she snapped crossly, "How dare you!" With an excruciating slowness, the stranger unsheathed a long, powerful sword, and then tilted his helmeted head to the side, an effective, impudent response. Kessa's heartbeat quickened as she realized this was likely one of Werner's soldiers come to collect her, or worse, carry out her sentence. "Would you compromise a woman so before she dies?" she scolded, trying to remain calm. "Please allow me some decency before you carry out your duty." She hoped he would, and maybe in doing so provide her with an opportunity to escape. He watched her in stony silence for a couple moments, the horse's impatient prancing and scraping at the ground not fazing him. Then he said, "I don't have to allow you anything." His voice echoed in his fully enclosed and very imposing helm. Using his sword, he scooped up her black tunic and leggings that were strewn on the bank. "You see, by all accounts, I have the advantage here, young miss." With an acidic smile, Kessa endeavored to hide the various emotions coursing through her. She couldn't believe his audacity. Perhaps another tactic would be more effective than demands. "Undeniably you do, sir. I suppose I must depend upon your moral code and honor not to milk the situation for its full worth." She noted the crossbow attached to the saddle and was glad she hadn't attempted to swim away. Traversing the shallow current, she would have made for a very easy target. "Indeed," he replied. Although his face was entirely concealed, she swore he was sneering. thoroughly enjoying every moment of this situation, like some kind of perverted courtier. Rest assured, miss, no harm will come to you. I take care of my possessions, and since you are unprotected and in my river, trespassing no less, you now belong to me. Heat returned to her face. By my father's mistress, I do not. I don't know that your father has a mistress. Even if he does, I'm not sure she'd vouch for you. He chuckled when her eyes widened and her lips parted in surprise. I hear King Cassius pays a fine price for ripe young maids. Pleased by her response of a deeper flush, he said, I require you to tell me who you are and what you're doing in my river. This is not your river, and I am not your concern. I tire very quickly of this conversation, and that is more perilous for you than swimming without the benefit of clothing in a wood infested with outlaws and vagabonds. Unluckily for me, I came face to face with the vilest, most annoying one in the whole wood. Refuse to answer me once more, and you'll feel more than mere annoyance. His sword glinted. If you must know, she looked away, delaying and totally discounting the threat of his weapons. After a few seconds, she concocted a convincing story. My father is a traveling minstrel. I sing with him, and you've interrupted my preparation for our next show. The horse huffed loudly and pawed at the ground. Yes, my friend, I too detect a falsehood. He shoved her clothing into his saddlebag. I prize honesty above creativity. He sighed resignedly. I will trouble you no further. Good day. His helmet dipped as he nodded farewell. My clothes! She cried in dismay as the horse plodded haughtily toward the trees. They're the cost of swimming in my river, young miss, he called back, since you refuse to pay the other one. The truth. Oh, she huffed as he vanished into the woods. The absolute impertinence! His river, indeed! She'd always assumed the Irenian belonged to the Lord of Aquina. However, it was plausible that with Pantheus's demise the land had been sold, maybe even promised to the successful assassin. Eyes narrowing with the evolving notion that she'd just possibly encountered Pantheus's killer, Kessa growled, If I ever run into him again, I'll... She slapped the water repeatedly, sending waves of clear aqua flying. Her naked state, however, still prevented any opportunity for revenge or retribution. Figures. Those were the only clothes I had, too. A recollection of their hurried escape plunged into her mind. They'd had little time to collect any belongings. She'd fled with only the clothing she'd been wearing. Her beloved horse, clothing, trinkets, and the treasures she'd collected had been left behind. She looked around frantically, as if she expected her observations to somehow change her situation. Noticing a thick blanket of storm clouds rolling swiftly towards her, she sunk down into the water, whispering, Figures, just figures. Thunder sounded, and the rain began to pour soon after. No one would have suspected that the drops of water on Kessa's face were not just raindrops, but frustrated, desolate tears. Equestria's concern for her sister only increased once the rainstorm hit. Kessa had only gone to bathe and should have returned once the weather changed. It wasn't safe to swim when there was lightning. Kessa knew this. Regretting having let her sister go alone, Equestria seized her sword and went to look for her. She hadn't gone very far when she heard the clip-clop of hooves. The rain ceased as abruptly as it began. Kessa forced herself to quit being irrational and calm down. In her mind, crying was only useful if you were a baby. but that didn't mean she wasn't susceptible. Realizing she was getting chilly and her skin was severely pruned, she rubbed her goose-bumped limbs, trying to warm them. She'd half hoped that lightning would strike her and end her misery, but no such luck. Exiting the water was inevitable, and no amount of time in the Iranian was going to resolve her predicament. Part of her had been hoping her sister would rescue her, but for one reason or another, her sister was a no-show. Perhaps she herself was in need of rescuing, though knowing her sister, Kessa doubted that. Scanning the area for any unwanted spectators, Kessa slowly hedged toward the shore. Once she was fairly certain there was no one about, conspicuously anyway, she darted out of the water, grabbed her boots, took out the dagger she'd hidden within them, and fled toward the campsite. Not far ahead, she was relieved to locate her clothing, which the stranger had shamelessly discarded in a tree hollow. Pulling them out, she rejoiced at discovering them dry and bug-free. Hearing the faint clangs of a sword fight, she grinned, guessing that Equestria had found that rude, distasteful ruffian who'd deprived her of her dignity for a time, and was teaching him a thorough lesson. She dressed quickly, anxious to catch at least some of the lesson. The armored man laughed. "No wonder you made captain of the Aguilons." He parried her blow and riposted. Any onlooker would decide that despite his expensive armor and well-crafted sword, his female adversary definitely had the advantage. Her speed and skill made up for what she lacked in armor. Her beautifully executed lunge attack would have devastated her opponent, but she slipped on a damp, mossy rock and lost her balance. Before she could recover, a sword tip hovered at her neck. A victorious chuckle resounded through the helmet. "Now that was indeed fortunate for me, Captain." He sheathed his sword and offered her a hand. Brushing the mud off her hands, Equestria gave him a large grin that soon transformed into a shocked outcry. "Kessa, no!" The latter charged the victorious combatant, dagger in uninjured hand. Her target rotated, patently surprised by her attack, for he did nothing to prevent it. Equestria quickly threw her leg into the air. Tripping over it, her sister stumbled into the man's unsuspecting arms, her attack thwarted. Obviously alarmed and embarrassed, Kessa yanked away, careful of her injury, but still targeting him with the point of her weapon. Her sister had purposely foiled her attack. Why? "What's going on?" she questioned furiously, never taking her eyes off the stranger. In answer, he removed his helmet, revealing his identity. Dark blonde hair, damp with sweat, hung down to just past his jawline, which was covered with a neatly cropped, boxed beard. Stained glass blue eyes dazzled against his handsome features. Standing at 6'3", Kessa guessed he was muscular, though it was difficult to tell since he was clad in armor. Kessa's dagger lowered, but her free, injured hand slammed against the newly disclosed cheek with a resounding smack. She waved her hand with the resulting pain. Somehow she'd forgotten her injury. Confusion furrowed Equestria's brow as she watched the exchange. She'd assumed Kessa would be overjoyed to discover Pantheus was alive. "Kess, that's no way to greet—" "It's all right, Equestria." He waved a dismissive hand at her. "This is not our first meeting today. If I might add, Kessa, I'd never have recognized you with your clothes on, except maybe for the magnitude of your punch." He rubbed his cheek, smirking. This was not the first time Kessa had hit him, and probably wouldn't be the last. They'd often roughhoused and sparred, though he knew how to pull back his punches. Kessa did not. Equestria's eyes widened as she comprehended what must have happened earlier. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth when her sister's cheeks turned pink. Well, Equestria said, rising and wiping off her bottom, smearing the mud. What an... She paused, searching for an appropriate word. Interesting coincidence. Directing a dirty look at her sister, Kessa shivered and then, reluctantly, put away her weapon. Lord Aguilon deprived me of my clothes for a time. Amusement plainly written across her face, Equestria saw it was now Pantheus's turn to blush. I owe you, Kessie. He wriggled his jaw as if to confirm his statement. For quite a bit. Redirecting his attention to Equestria, he asked, You warned Kessa to stop her attack, even when my sword tip was at your throat. Did you know it was me? Of course. Familiar mannerisms and an air of camaraderie I wouldn't feel from a stranger. But it was really your father's sword that tipped me off. Pantheus smiled. Impressive, Captain. He looked sideways at Kessa, adding cynically, Kessa didn't make the connection. The taunt brought her back from wondering why her stomach had flipped upon hearing the nickname he alone had used for her, Kessie. I was preoccupied. Ugh. Can we discuss all this later? Thunder rumbled, backing up Kessa's urgency. I'm cold and it's going to rain again. I suggest we find shelter. No one argued with that logic. If, of course, you don't resent our trespassing, Kessa added sarcastically. Pantheus, disregarding her comment, untied his horse. Where's Falcon? Kessa asked with concern. He's back at the stable. He's fine, Kessa. He steered his steed forward, and soon they were trudging along less traveled forest paths that led to the castle. The storm resumed its raging, which made everyone miserable, and the way that much more difficult. As they walked, Lord Aguilon explained why they were told he was dead. Only a select few know I'm alive. Stopping, he offered his assistance over a large log that blocked their path. Ignoring Kessa's pointed refusal for aid, he took Equestria's proffered hand and helped her over the fallen tree. His horse, needing no urging, had already jumped the hurdle without difficulty. They waited while Kessa scrambled over the log, scraping her wounded hand in the process. After she'd finished jumping around, holding her hand in muted agony, Pantheus continued. I have a better chance of survival if Cassius believes he owns my castle and lands. Also, if he believes you're out of the way, you're not a threat to his throne, Equestria added. Pantheus inclined his head. We weren't told the circumstances of your death. We assumed it wasn't an accident, but an assassination. You assumed right. I can only assume, since I received an anonymous tip that the king wanted me dead, that it was he who tried to have me poisoned. Fortunately, a servant detected the poison and warned me. After a thorough investigation, one of the kitchen servants confessed she'd been coerced. A blackguard, likely the king's henchman, had kidnapped her daughter and threatened to kill her if the poison wasn't administered. So, I pretended the poison did its job. As you know, Cassius has many spies, so I must be careful. Only the people in the castle know I'm alive. I don't dare ride Falcon about town, lest someone make the connection. Falcon was known as the Lord of Aquina's horse, after all. News reached me about the warrants out for both of you, and I thought you might come here. I warned my staff to keep a lookout. If they'd allowed you entry, it might have raised suspicion. The situation will benefit you regardless. If your pursuers believe you went elsewhere, you'll be safe at the castle for a while. At least until other arrangements can be made. Risky, don't you think? What if Cassius sends someone to take over the castle? It's likely, you know. Kessa looked to Equestria for agreement. Or even worse, the dungeon keeper could request shelter there. He is on our tail, after all. She winced at her bloodied bandage. After moving a branch out of their way, Pantheus asked Equestria, Your husband? He poses a threat? A very big one, exclaimed Kessa. Equestria moved another branch out of her way. He believes in law and order. Things weren't exactly as I expected them to be, she managed. You mean he wasn't the man you expected him to be, Kessa corrected. Equestria avoided eye contact, but her face showed all her annoyance. Assessing the girls thoughtfully for a spell, Pantheus tactfully changed the subject. The king is preoccupied with Tania lately. It seems the tension has escalated, though I don't know why. I don't think we have anything to fear from the king at any rate. I've taken all the necessary precautions possible. Things will be safe for the time being. This way. Acknowledging that circumstances had indubitably changed for the better all around, Equestria exclaimed with relief, Thank goodness you're alive, Pantheus.